Hey everybody, International Master David Pruess here for the ChessDojo, and I'm just coming back from an international chess tournament, Sunway Sitges in Barcelona, and it was an incredible experience. I mean, I used to enjoy chess tournaments, but I think I enjoyed this one more than I used to enjoy chess tournaments for several reasons. I mean, I think one is that I've gotten over sort of the ego part, so I can have fun even on the games where I blow a win and draw, or blow a draw and lose, or blow a win and lose, or get ground down, or suffer, or fall into my opponent's opening prep, or whatever. You know, all the different like horror stories that are out there for chess players. I think most of them affect me much less now because the ego's kind of off to the side. That's one part. And then another part is I haven't played a 9-round tournament in at least 9 to 10 years, maybe more. I don't remember when the last one was. It was a long time ago. So I think when you get something more rarely, it may be natural to appreciate it more. So I appreciated the heck out of this chess tournament. It was so much fun. And, in a sense, I wish it could just go on, or I could, go on to the next tournament like I used to run around on the tournament circuit. But still, it's a pleasure to have the games that I've played to look at and think about, reflect on. Over the next period of time, I'll continue to draw some joy from them. And because I have some number of people following my chess teaching videos, exploits, whatever, I thought it would be natural and fun to share some highlights with you. In the interest of having shorter videos, because I definitely like to be thorough, I'm going to do some highlights, and I'm going to split them up into, I expect, 4 parts. And this first part is going to be the most bite-sized of those parts, because the first 3 rounds of this tournament were kind of a warm-up. I fell sick somewhere around the second or third day of the tournament. There was a day where I had a terrible headache and couldn't really prepare well, and didn't have much energy. And that went into the third game. I don't know if I started on the second or third day being sick. But then as of the 4th day, I recovered and got to play the rest of the tournament with energy. And also having not played for so long, it took me a couple days perhaps anyway to get into the rhythm of things. But okay, here are some of the best moments I hope you will enjoy. And let's get right into it. So this game here is from the first round. Alba de Lomas Busquets is playing up 400 points or more against this retired international master from the United States. The first round in general, almost without exception, you get the biggest rating differences. And so it was 400 to 450 points on every board. And generally the higher rated players score moderately close to 100%, or used to in the old days, when you had this kind of a gulf. You could have a 200 board tournament, and this one was maybe 150 boards, or about 300 people in the section. So let's say you could have about 150 boards, and in the old days you might have one upset, and 149 times like the higher rated player taking care of business as it was conceived of then. But I think the gap has shrunk a little bit. Like the worst players are just better than they used to be, so to speak. The level that you need to be at to be 1800 or 1900 or 2000, etc., and be playing up against an IM or GM is really high now. And so check out what this player did. She's a young player, about 20 years old, not a kid, but not old yet. So probably still some energy and some ambition. And White's playing an anti-young person opening, this English opening here. And places the pawn on e3 to deaden this bishop. And if all goes to plan, the knight comes to e2, pawn can come to d4, and White can start taking over the center. So in this position, Alba played a very, very strong and brave move, which is d5. Sacking this pawn, apparently, in a million ways. But actually, if you think about it, it's attacked 3 times and only defended twice. So it's not really hanging by 10 million %, but it's still a pawn sacrifice, and a pretty cool one. So black can take with the pawn, with the knight, with the bishop. In the game, I took with the knight. If you take with the pawn, the next move from black is still going to be knight b4, with the idea of either landing knight d3 check and disrupting white's development pretty badly, or of playing knight takes d5, or a third and perhaps most deadly threat in this position is bishop f5, going into d3 and c2. So for example, it occurred to me, like, I don't really mind if black takes the pawn back on d5, right? Like, white could live with that. So, white could play a move like knight to e2, and if black plays knight d3 check, then they're not getting back this pawn, and the king just slides over. And if knight takes d5, then white castles, and, white's development is going fine. It looks kind of like a normal English or Sicilian. But I think that Alba had probably planned this really evil move here, bishop f5, threatening knight c2 check, winning the rook. And so, the natural thing to do is to escape with the king, because you can't defend these 2 squares anyway. But actually, there's one move, e4, which I'll show you in a moment. But if you castle, black has this absolutely disgusting trap. That would be quite a highlight to win in under 10 moves against somebody 400 points higher rated. But okay, I did see that. I didn't fall for that. But let's go bishop f5 again. Let me show you the problem with e4. Is that black can go knight d3 check, king here, and now this bishop has been opened up. So now black takes here, hitting the queen and the rook, and against queen a4, you save this bishop as well. And although it looked complicated 2 moves ago, like, oh, everybody's got stuff, hanging and going on, but within one move, it clarifies that, white's king can't castle, white's rook is in bad shape, black's pieces are suddenly more or less safe, still got a queen and rook attacked. So black comes out very, very well there. So it's very challenging. So, okay, so I played knight takes d5, and she traded and brought the knight to b4. And, black could win back the pawn, which would be perfectly good from black's perspective, but not a disaster for white. Or they could adventure into d3 next. But most of all, there's this threat that the bishop could still come to f5, and that could still be a problem. So I played queen to b3, defending both the pawn and the d3 square. And here it's very, very tricky for black to find the right move. And so, it was really excellent of Alba to find d5, but this follow-up is the biggest highlight here and best lesson for us from this game. Because in this position, if she just goes ahead with the normal bishop f5 plan, attacking these 2 squares, white has e4, and suddenly we see the point of trading the knight on c3. It was so that there's no knight d3 check in this position. So, okay, this bishop has become good, but white's locked in this pawn, right? It's defended. This bishop has to cede space, giving way. White has time to even kick another piece away. And, okay, black just lost a center pawn and then retreated 2 pieces, so it's not going to work out, even if the bishop on c5 has gotten better. So very, very tricky to find a good move for black here. And as far as I know, there's only one really good move, and Alba found it. So, if you really want to challenge yourselves, you could stop for a moment and see if you can find it. It's a very difficult test, but anybody feeling like, 2,000 plus, very, very strong about themselves can try and find it. Disclaimer, this isn't computer checked or anything. It's just my opinion as well. So don't get mad at me if I'm wrong and there's 3 correct moves or the move I show you is wrong. Anyway, I'm going to show you the move which I think is really good, which he played, and it is c6. Yeah. Lovely move. So the idea is that if white plays a move like a3 to keep the knight away from these squares here, the knight comes here and this pawn is nicely defending the d5 square. And also just in general blunting the bishop on g2 and the rook on c1 at some point. So it's well placed for the Sicilian or English kind of position that we have. Honestly, maybe that's the best that white has, and maybe that's what I should have just done was a3. But I took on the adventure and I took on c6, and now we get to see the real point of black's plan. It's not to temporarily get access to the d3 square and play knight d3 as kind of a throwaway. If you play knight d3 too early ever as black and like give up on this stuff here, black doesn't have the follow-up to deliver a crushing blow to white's king yet, and you spent too much energy just landing a check. In fact, white could even play king e2 perhaps and ask you to lose more time on the knight because white's hoping to put this pawn on b7 and start winning major material. So the idea is really just to take back with this b pawn, which is like really, really weird, right? We've just sacked the pawn, shattered our pawn structure, made this bishop on g2 look incredibly good, and also, it's kind of risky. Like, what's going to happen to us on c6? But it gives black a lot of potential between bishop a6 and rook b8 to just sort of jumpstart the activity of all the black pieces. And we don't even necessarily need to land a knight on d3 as black. You could just put the bishop on a6 now and sort of prevent castling that way. And, white can put a knight on e2, but they still, how would they castle? If they castle, they'll be sacking bishop takes e2, right? So just bishop a6, and then you hold knight d3 over white's head, and this position here is an example where hanging knight d3 over white's head is often stronger than playing knight d3. The famous chess saying, the threat is stronger than the execution, which is often not true. But it's sometimes true, right? These things always come from somewhere, so they're not always true or always untrue. But here, having knight d3 hanging over white's head is often better than actually playing it. Bringing the bishop here, maybe playing a move like rook b8, so that hangs over the head, or maybe going back to this bishop f5 move here, threatening knight d3 and knight c2, now that e4 won't save the pawn and will just open up this bishop. So I would say like 3 moves that black could play next, they're going to put a lot of pressure on white. And at this point, I can tell you that I was feeling like there was about a 50% chance I wouldn't make it to move 20. So a really, really excellent thing that Alba has done in this game is not only that objectively the moves played, I think, were excellent moves, but they were very aggressive, even though she was outrated, even though she was black. And let me just say, like, you could play aggressively, but very carefully the first several moves of a game as black. That's very, very logical or reasonable, right? And then turn up the aggression later on in the game once things are, going your way or waiting for a mistake from the opponent. But the level of fear and pressure that she chose to exert and apply with black this early was really terrifying. It made it very, very hard for me to play the game. And in this position, I kind of freaked out and played this super complicated move d4, sacking the pawn back and exploding the whole center where my king is. And we had sort of like a crazy tactical skirmish from here. But I think very, very nicely played this opening by black to put maximum pressure on white. So that's where we'll leave that game. Again, this is highlights. We can't go through every move of every game, but very, very nice sequence here from black in this opening, starting with d5 pawn sack, and then this c6 move, which is very, very unusual. Anybody who got it, by the way, anyone who paused their video and found this move, mad props to you, unless the computer says we're both wrong and that it was stupid and black should have just done something else. But otherwise, mad props to you, at least from me. And let's go to round 2. In round 2, I'm going to highlight something that's actually a variation that didn't even come up over the board, okay? To me, one of the coolest things in this entire game is a variation that white saw during the game and then demonstrated to me in the postmortem that I couldn't see on my own during the game. And let's just say White had played a ton of opening preparation and knowledge against me, so I was really low on time at this point in the game, and so it was very hard for me to keep up with everything that White was doing and seeing. But in this position here, I was looking at the move e3, and it was a very, very challenging move, but I did not see the follow-up idea. And Grandmaster Sasikiran, who used to be 2700, showed me the following idea for Black, which almost hurts White. Okay, it's clearly the critical move e3, and now to Sashi and I, it's clear that White's going to play f3 to try and blockade this pawn rather than opening up the king. Maybe to other people it's not clear that this is going to be bad for White, but basically this king's going to be very exposed. We're probably about to have a dark square bishop trade. The king's going to be weak on these light squares along the second rank without the f pawn, potentially on the long diagonal. If the queen or bishop get to e4, obviously the d5 pawn cuts out some of the long diagonal, but okay, the medium diagonal from e4 is going to be dangerous. So this position just in general looks terrifying for White, and so the line we would expect is for White to play f3, and again, this is the move that covers the most squares around the king compared to f4, grabbing space but weakening the king. So this is the expected move, and now, okay, we look if grabbing a tempo with bishop f5, trying to somehow break this blockade could be useful. Queen has to stay on b2 or b3 or c1 to defend the bishop. And here, I'd had like a vague thought of is there any way to, follow into this square, or even in this position to play a building move and after White takes, to take with the queen. But I hadn't realized that what bishop f5 sets up is it takes control of the b1 square. And so you can trade and then destroy your own pawn structure with this move, queen b4. And then if White takes and you take, White's actually just dying here, right? It's just a horrendous situation where White is more or less unable to deal with this b pawn. Like, for example, you play g4, the bishop just hangs out in here, right? Just escorting that pawn. And I don't know, maybe the most White can do is to blockade on b2 with the rook. But then we get this situation where the rook is 100% trapped by the pawn and bishop, which means that on the rest of the board, Black's playing with an extra exchange. And, maybe White plays for like f4, king f3, trying to bring the king this way. But Black has a pretty quick plan of rook a8, takes a4 to a2, just kind of promoting that pawn anyway. So I feel like White's probably pretty much dead in that position. And Sasikiran had seen that idea and had seen that in this position here, he could hold the balance with rook to c1. And that's what he'd planned to do. And now the idea is to evict this bishop with g4 to get it off of the b1 square, because otherwise these pieces are frozen forever. Like, you can never take a takes b4, right? You eventually lose. So if you're completely frozen, something bad could eventually happen. But actually, as it turns out, h5 to keep the bishop's position, h3, and White's able to play g4, kick the bishop back, and fully hold the balance. So Sashi had seen all of that in our time scramble and showed it and explained it to me in the post-mortem, and I thought, oh, what a fantastic idea. I kind of missed it and just played a simple move f5, trying to play for f4, and that he also found an easy solution to with bishop d2, just covering those squares, and if the bishop trade, the queen comes and takes over, covering those squares. And this also maintains equality. The position was equal, and actually the game just ended there because he offered a draw and I had 10 seconds on the clock, and I've almost never accepted a draw before in my life, which means that there are millions of times that I've lost games on time in random positions like this. So this time with 10 seconds, I took the draw. The position was about equal, but this was really the key variation, this e3, that he can hold that together against queen b4, which is a surprising move. And that's a useful idea to know for the future, right? That a move like queen b4 destroying my own queenside structure where white has the majority 3-on-2, right? So this is a very unusual move. But now it's in my arsenal. Now I know about it. All right. Now a thing from round 3. Round 3, finally I've got an opponent caught in my preparation, but not quite caught. As you'll see, they're going to be up to the challenge. But here we've got a game that is following something I've prepared for once. And so I'm white, and I've played an unusual variation, and my opponent is in the position I was in round 2 of having to burn a lot of time trying to figure out what to do. In this position here, white's just traded on d5. And I think that the standard not thinking move for a lot of people would be pawn takes d5, promoting this weak backward pawn into a center pawn that's also a passed pawn. Do you guys see the difference between this pawn and this pawn? Right? Seems like a promotion for this guy. Right? And secondarily, it looks like black's maybe playing for the endgame with 2 pawns versus 1 on the queen side, or let's say, less pawn islands than black, right? Whether black takes with the pawn or the knight, black's the one with split pawns. So it feels like black's playing a little bit more for the endgame, so you also wouldn't want to trade pieces because of that normally, right? But every chess position is concrete and has pluses and minuses to doing it, and this is a decision one could agonize over for a long time. And Grandmaster Martin Kraemer of Germany found the correct answer, which is knight takes d5 exclam, giving this bishop a better square to go to on f6. And it's going to get there in time before white can play like rook b1, b4, and just start expanding away. And let me just tell you, in my opinion, after pawn takes d5, bishop e3, white has a small advantage. First of all, there's no d4. Check. Famous trap. So there's no d4. But my other point is this. Basically, this knight is in sort of the attacking position, and this knight is in the defending position. So we can now see that this knight is kind of the superior of the 2 knights in this situation. This knight's also blocking this bishop from improving. So this bishop's going to come to d4. And look how good it's going to be, aiming at the king side, aiming at the queen side. The pair of bishops on d3 and d4, they're actually kind of dominating both sides of the board, which is kind of insane. And when you're the attacking piece, you've got that flexibility that you can switch to other attacks. Whereas if this piece moves off somewhere, white can take on d5. So it needs to sit here guarding the pawn. So I think white would have a small advantage if black took with the pawn. I think it's quite a big deal. Whereas with knight takes d5, black has every hope and expectation of equalizing. So I give this move a nice exclam. And if white played bishop d2, which I considered but didn't play, then again, this bishop just comes to long diagonal. Knight e4 is going to sack this pawn in a way that has no real chances of an advantage for white. Otherwise, black is threatening to trade everything off on c3 and give white the same isolated pawn structure as black with basically a clear equality. And the bishop's just on a nice post there immediately. So in the game, I chose to play knight takes d5. I'm going to speed through a little bit. He now promotes the pawn. But now, without these knights, it's much better than before. I played bishop e3. Again, hopefully you guys know not to play d4. My opponent plays bishop f6. Attacking the pawn and starting to win control of the blockade square. Another difference between this position, right? Like, I'm actually going to control this blockade square and keep the pawn from advancing any further. But in the game, my opponent plays bishop f6 in this position, and we see, this pawn's probably going to advance to d4. b2's hanging as well. So I played developing the rook to the open file. I didn't really see a way to contest this d4 move, so I didn't. Bishop takes b2 here would run into bishop takes here, king takes here, queen here, here. It's hard to evaluate. It seems like, who's the pawn structure better for, white or black? And you could say the center or the pass pawn could both be advantages for black. The center, if it were a middle game, the pass pawn if it were an endgame, so it's got to be one or the other. So black's happy versus a rook pawn, the worst of all pawns, only attacks half as many squares. But here the key point is this pawn is going to block the opposite colored bishop. And my opposite colored bishop is going to go to d4 again. And so I would again argue that white's slightly better here. And I could again be wrong because, I'm not a grandmaster of evaluation. But I thought it's actually nice for me that this pawn is in the way. I could even see black just sacking the pawn right away so this bishop lives freely and black can claim that the extra pawn won't be much to try and win with because it is a pretty bad pawn. But my point is that this is kind of a bad pawn just for blocking its own piece. So my opponent correctly just pushes forward d4, gaining space for that pawn. And here comes another sequence of two very strong moves from black. You guys can pause and try and guess the move for black here and on the next move if you want to. I'm going to introduce it by showing you what might not be so good. To me, the obvious moves are like bishop b7 and bishop e6, developing this bishop. Bishop b7, rook c7, and now you can never coordinate with like queen d5 in time. Actually, wait, why couldn't it go queen d5 now? What did I had in mind? I guess just here, and now it's just too many things hanging on this diagonal. So, I think the bishop has to go to d5, and then after queen a4, I think white's got a nice little plus where the rook is sort of getting into black's business. This pawn's getting tickled. This pawn's under control for the moment, and white's rooks are reasonably active. I mean, I would expect that black is okay, but I would prefer white in this position. That's all we're kind of talking about is, this position is definitely close to equal, but we're talking about very, very slight advantages, like is there a preference for white or for black? And then I guess the other move would be bishop e6, and then again, I would probably play like queen a4, covering the a2 pawn and starting to look at these pawns. And yeah, I think in general there's a thing that as long as this pawn is nicely blockaded by this bishop and this bishop is well placed, then this pawn is going to be blocking one of the black bishops, and white's just going to have like a touch of extra activity and have some potential to be better. Okay, so having seen those two ideas and my take on them such as it is, maybe you'll see why I think black's next move was very nice. Black played queen to d5. And yeah, maybe I should have just played f3 now, but there was something. But even on f3, threatening bishop e4, right? There's just going to be bishop f5 stopping bishop e4. And now black's going to be very nice. So I'll tell you like the secret to this position in full now, which is if black can trade these bishops, this is a little bit surprising, but if black can trade these bishops, black's going to get a good position. Normally in isolated queen pawn positions, you would want to trade the bishop that's blocked for the bishop that can attack your pawn. And you would want to keep this bishop on the board that's your open active piece. But here, this piece is always going to be slightly good, and your main directive is to break down the blockade as black. So what queen d5 is truly setting up is not so much bishop b7 as bishop f5, trying to get rid of this piece. And that's kind of the beauty of this position. And in hindsight, maybe the only challenging move I could have tried to play for white would have been queen c2 to stop bishop f5. And I was a little leery about allowing myself to get weakened if I didn't have a good follow-up right away afterwards. Now g6 or h6 or queen h5. Maybe it has to be queen h5, bishop e4, queen b5, bishop e4, d3. Yeah, I'm kind of feeling like maybe queen h5, or maybe if you go g6, bishop e4, you could drop back here and not get tempoed any further. So maybe it's, yeah, I mean, that would be the one thing left for me to explore, would be maybe queen c2, the one move to actually prevent bishop f5 in this position. it's a little discoordination to get the queen in the way of the rook on this file, right? Like I always wanted my queen on a4 or f3 and sliding to the king side, or even just d2, sitting behind the bishop and quarterbacking. But this was a very nice move. I think queen d5, and then after rook to e1, my opponent played bishop f5, and suddenly we see white's in danger of losing control of the blockade square. And when this pawn advances to d3, it's going to be clearly stronger than it is weak, right? And white's going to be in a horrible defensive situation. So, yeah, I mean, here white has to start being careful not to end up worse even. And I found a way to trade off a bunch of pieces to avoid losing control of d3, but black has just completely dealt with the opening at this point, right? The choice to trade the knight, get the bishop to a nice square on f6, advance the pawn even though it blocks the bishop, confident there's enough room to then develop this bishop and try and break the next blockade of the pawn. And black is just cruising at that point. So I'm going to show you maybe just really quickly for completeness on this. I played this funny move, bishop e5, breaking the queen's connection with f5. And if black takes on d3, then white can take on f6, cracking the king side apart. And if this bishop runs away, then black's going to lose a pawn and have this sort of bad opposite colored bishop situation. So black had to take on e5 anyway. I take here. Now I'm threatening to just have the better opposite colored bishop position because this bishop is still blocked if I have time to retreat my bishop. So black is forced to continue with tactics here, 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 here. And then we get this endgame. White's got 2-on-1 on the queen side, which is mildly advantageous, but there's heavy pieces and one less pawn covering the king. So I think it's fully balanced, and the game was eventually drawn as I would expect from here. Let's move on to round 4. This round, my opponent, Stephen Le Pen, 2100. He's playing up a couple hundred points, and he comes up with a slightly surprise opening variation and gets us both into a position where I think we were both kind of freestyling a little bit. He obviously had some experience in general with open Sicilians, and me as well, but not with this exact setup. I've kind of transposed things over towards a weird dragon where white has a pawn, didn't have a pawn on f3 with which to play a normal Yugoslav attack, and the bishop was already on g2, so white had to come up with a different way to play this position than the Yugoslav attack, which is honestly, for many people, the only plan they know against the dragon, right? Okay, in this position I played as black a fairly obvious move, knight a5, looking to play knight to c4, and I was expecting a very standard response for white, b3 to control that square, and that slightly weakens the c-file, and then black needs to rearrange the pieces to start coming up with some new threats along the c-file now that there's not knight c4, but that's kind of the standard thing I would expect. Now, if the king were already on b1, I would say there would also be an option of playing like queen e2, knight c4, bishop c1. Would be a very common way of dodging out of a knight c4 plan in the Sicilian. If you don't want to weaken your king with b3, right? You can just dodge the queen, knight c4, save the bishop. And occasionally I've even seen someone allow knight c4, queen moves, take the bishop pair, queen takes e3. But almost always I've seen that associated with taking a lead in development. Like black hasn't finished development. They're early in the game playing knight e5 or knight a5. And I've sometimes seen white just ignore it, develop very hastily, let knight c4, knight takes e3 come in and try and bust black by opening up the center before black has developed their castle. That's not the case here. But my opponent stopped here, and he thought hard, and he figured out a really non-trivial attempt to start busting black. And mind you, he needs to figure out how to deal with this. He also needs to figure out a plan because he doesn't have a pawn on f3, and he can't play a Yugoslav attack anymore. If he ever goes h4, bishop takes g4, it's not obvious how he's going to bust the king with black having this nice control over g4. So he needs a plan in general, and it looks like I'm threatening knight c4. And in the midst of that, he figured out just an absolute bomb of a move, and it was e5. Now, the nice thing about this move is it's trying to punish this knight when it can't go towards the center. And in general, there's a whole talk about when do you want to play e5 versus a knight on f6 in chess, and it can be a tricky question, but there's a basic rule of thumb that if you play e5 and the knight can just go to e4 or d5, it's unlikely to be that powerful. This is sort of in the opening, and we're kind of coming out of the opening into the middle game, but and if the knight has to go back to one of the squares on the side of the board, like knight h5, it's often trapped, knight g8, it'll keep black from castling, knight e8, it'll interfere with the coordination of black's pieces, then that often means e5 is good. And that is the case here, but it's far less trivial because he had to calculate knight c4 attacking the queen and the e5 pawn and the bishop and, knight takes b2 kind of stuff. And he also had to calculate takes, and then knight c4, which just doubles pretty much the massive variations you have to look at. So just difficulty level-wise is very hard to handle. Let me tell you that White's idea was to just sack the queen and take a bunch of pieces. And the game goes like here and here, threatening pawn takes rook, getting a queen. But the knight's so strong on c4 that here you have to calculate not just king takes pawn, but also knight c4, I think. But the basic idea would be here, here. And now White's got 3 pieces against the queen. So it's nice and creative of White, but I pretty much quickly agreed that the evaluation here was going to be decent for White. And so then I started looking at, well, what if I came back, what if after pawn takes, I came back here and sacked the rook? Would the knight on c4 be enough for me to launch, a deadly attack with just the pieces I have left? I've got a tempo on the bishop. It's very, very tricky to figure this out. But I decided that bishop g1, so the bishop's defended. Then queen b6. White doesn't have to play b3, weakening the king position. White can just play knight b3. And then I think the attack is more or less gone. And White's got 2 pieces and a rook, and will be able to sort of take over the game. All these variations had to be calculated as well after takes, here with some different flavors. Let me show you one other branch of this that I was thinking of, which was pawn takes, bishop takes. Just not taking the queen, just a piece sacrifice. The idea is you hit the queen, she comes somewhere like e2 or d3, and then you go queen b6. And oh la 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 la, like every black piece is striking at these targets together. It hangs together by a thread for White. This was very, very difficult to calculate. And you can calculate, as I said, the same position without these pawns on the board, and then black has the extra option of rook d8, cutting off the king from escaping. It was a mass, a really, really difficult mass to calculate, and as proven by the fact that I'm not going to show you guys every single variation, because I think it's more than you would stick around to watch. And I've been known to show a lot of variations. So very, very difficult move to find and play. But Steven found it, and I felt obliged to retreat the knight back to e8, leaving White with a very, very nice position with the inclusion of this. Now it gets very, very hard to get out of this file. Anytime that black wants to take on like e5, for example, they have to calculate moves like knight e6, trying to take their pieces. So it's very, very difficult, and this knight was on e8 for a while. Unfortunately, it's not easy to get it out. So this was a really, really powerful find here to kick off the middle game, saying just like the first round opponent Alba, right? Just showing no fear of a higher rated player and just going for the throat, from the get-go of the game, playing aggressive moves, being willing to sack material or trade material, go into imbalanced positions. I remember when I was coming up in chess that when I was 1600 playing other 1600s, 1800 playing other 1800s, a lot of those players were marked by a fear of extreme imbalances. Like, they didn't want to trade their queen for 2 rooks, nor did they want to trade 2 rooks for a queen, you know what I mean? Or, they didn't want to receive an exchange sack or give an exchange sack. It was all too scary and difficult to evaluate. And here you can see, from the get-go, all these lower rated, so to speak, opponents that I'm facing have absolutely no fear of the positions or of the player, right? They're just giving their all, playing complicated moves and trusting in their own capabilities to play complicated positions that those moves will lead to. So very, very impressive. I played 2 more lower rated players in the second half of the tournament. And they also, as you will see, great highlights as well. They also showed no fear. So that's what I have for you for this first video. That covers almost the first half of the tournament. It was a 10-round tournament, so that was the first 4 rounds. Now, the 5th game of this tournament was one of the very, very best games of the tournament, so I'm saving that as like a final highlight. I'm keeping like the last bit sort of for the end. So this is like the first half of the medium highlights. The second video will be the second half of the medium highlights, from rounds 5 through 10. And then parts 3 and 4 are just going to be like the very, very pearls of the pearls that I saved for you. So you can look forward to the round 5 game eventually, which is amazing. And I'll show in its entirety, playing against a 12-year-old young prodigy. But that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any comments or thoughts on what you'd like to see more or less of or whatever, let me know. It probably won't affect this tournament's recaps, as I've already figured out what I want to do with the next couple videos. But if I ever get to play another tournament, it will affect how I present that tournament to you. And lastly, I just wanted to tell you all, it was a blast playing a chess tournament. Highly recommend it for anyone on the fence about playing or not. If you can do it, there are a few things that are this fun. And remember to when you go there, to check your ego, to respect your opponents, to appreciate the skills that they bring to the table. You saw what fantastic ideas my opponents blessed me with at this event, and that I was able to learn some cool things from every one of them. And I wish the same for you. Strong opponents who don't blunder their faces or show up late or forfeit, but who come in and bring you the best that they have and give you a game that you can really enjoy. All right, that's all for me for today. See you again soon. This is David signing off.